Because of her age, Priscilla Nelson didn't celebrate her own birthday in a long time. The old woman's husband passed away 10 years ago, which was an extremely painful loss for her. Ever since then, time seemed to stop for Mrs. Nelson. As if by magic, she stopped getting any visitors. She barely even got calls from her friends. I guess that's what it means to be old, Mrs. Nelson thought, sadly. Deep down, the woman didn't feel like an old woman, and therefore she didn't like her new status of a lonely recluse. But that day was special for Mrs. Nelson. After all, it's not every day that you get to turn 80 years old. That's an impressive age to live to, and definitely a cause for celebration. That morning, Mrs. Nelson got up earlier than usual. Sure, she wasn't planning on hosting a big celebration with the family. Basically, she simply wanted to make the day special for herself. She baked a chicken pie and cooked her signature potatoes. "Well, that's much better," Mrs. Nelson said after examining the results of her own work with a smile. But before she had the time to put the dishes on the table, the doorbell rang. Wondering who it could be, Mrs. Nelson opened the door and gasped in surprise. Her grandchildren Ethan and Floyd were standing on her doorstep. "They must have come to celebrate my birthday with me," Priscilla Nelson thought joyfully. "Hi, Grandma. What's that delicious smell? Are you expecting guests? Or is this some kind of celebration?" Floyd asked. Mrs. Nelson lowered her eyes and invited her guests into the kitchen. The poor woman naively believed that her grandchildren remembered her birthday and came to celebrate it with her, but the truth wasn't as cheerful. Meanwhile, Ethan and Floyd went about the house as if they owned the place, examining room after room. Moreover, they even kept writing something down in a notebook and quietly discussing all the advantages and disadvantages of the house. It was only when they reached the kitchen and saw the pie on the table that the grandkiddos remembered that it was their grandmother's 80th birthday. "Congratulations, Grandma! It smells so good!" Ethan exclaimed and unceremoniously sat down at the table. A minute later, he and his brother were already devouring the delicious pie. At this time, Mrs. Nelson smiled as she watched her grandchildren whom she helped raise. Unfortunately, when Ethan and Floyd grew up, they virtually stopped visiting their grandmother. And now, they didn't really come to celebrate her birthday. The purpose of their visit was very simple. They laid their eyes on Mrs. Nelson's house and even found a buyer for it. The old woman knew nothing about it and thought that her grandkiddos simply decided to renovate the house. But when the pie was gone, Ethan exchanged a glance with Floyd, after which he said, "Well, Grandma, pack your things." "Why would I need to pack? I wasn't planning on going anywhere today," the old woman exclaimed in surprise. "What do you mean, why? We're going to take you where you've long wanted to go," Ethan answered evasively. Shrugging her shoulders in bewilderment, Mrs. Nelson started gathering her things, while the young men continued to examine the house. The longer Mrs. Nelson's grandchildren stayed there, the more they liked it. Ethan and Floyd were already mentally counting the money they'd get for the house and thinking about what they'd spend it on. Having packed her things in a small suitcase, Mrs. Nelson had no idea where her grandchildren would take her. She suspected that Ethan and Floyd could have bought her a smaller house for some comfortable and easier life. The old woman had long dreamed of a small home in a village. Therefore, when the grandchildren started talking about moving, the old woman assumed that they decided to make her dream come true and made the mistake of agreeing to go with them. 5 minutes later, all three of them were already driving in an unknown direction. The grandchildren didn't utter a single word on their way, only exchanged meaningful glances with each other. Why are they being so mysterious? They must have prepared a surprise for me. They're probably nervous about it, Priscilla Nelson thought with a smile. But when Ethan and Floyd brought her to an inconspicuous building located outside the city, the old woman's heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Nelson had never been to this place, but when she looked at it, she saw something that made her heart beat anxiously. The woman was surprised to see a group of old people dressed in identical clothes. They were taking a walk in a small courtyard in front of the building. Some of them could walk on their own, while others needed help. "Well, that's it, Grandma. This is your new home," Floyd said, opening the door. At that moment, it became obvious that the grandchildren brought Mrs. Nelson to a nursing home in order to sell her house and share the proceeds. Ethan and Floyd had been thinking about this for a long time. The director of the nursing home met them at the entrance. He was actually in on the young men's plan. "Don't worry, Grandma, you're going to like it here," Ethan said, as if they were doing something casual. In all this time, Priscilla Nelson didn't say a single word. The woman was shocked that her grandkids could be so cruel, and on her birthday, too. Of course, she understood that they did it because they needed the money. But didn't she already help Ethan and Floyd in every way she could? Didn't Mrs. Nelson give them money to buy cars? Didn't she pay for their college? And now, instead of being grateful to her, they brought her to live out her life in a nursing home. At first, Mrs. Nelson was very anxious and barely even slept at night. But she soon got used to it and even found some advantages in her living situation. Priscilla Nelson was no longer lonely and could spend time with other old people like herself. Meanwhile, Floyd and Ethan were sitting in a restaurant and celebrating the successful sale of their grandma's house. "We should bring something over to Grandma, some fruit maybe," Ethan said. "Okay, I'll think of something. At the very least, I'll send someone over," Floyd answered. The next day, the devious young businessman turned to his old friend from college with the request. David was Floyd's colleague. They worked in an office of a trading firm. Unlike Floyd, David was a responsible and reliable employee who didn't allow himself to shirk work and blame it on others. Therefore, when Floyd turned to him with such a request, the man immediately realized that something was off, but he still couldn't say no to his colleague, especially since Floyd asked him to bring fruit and some groceries to an elderly woman. David grew up in an orphanage and valued family more than anything else in the world. Therefore, he simply couldn't comprehend how someone could put their own grandmother in a nursing home and then go on with their life as if nothing happened. Moreover, David knew all too well how cheap Floyd was and that he wouldn't give him a single cent to pay for the fruit and groceries for the elderly woman. But David didn't care about that. When Priscilla Nelson was informed that she had a visitor waiting for her, the old woman was overjoyed. "That's probably Ethan or Floyd. At least they found time to pay me a visit," the old woman thought. But when she saw an unfamiliar young man, Mrs. Nelson didn't really know how to react. Understanding how awkward Mrs. Nelson was feeling, David immediately explained what was happening and hurried to change the subject of their conversation. To her sincere amazement, Mrs. Nelson got so carried away by the conversation with the young man that she didn't notice how long they'd been talking. Having expressed sincere interest in her life, David endeared the old woman from the first minutes of their conversation. But the most important part was that the young man wasn't pretending, which was why he was behaving so naturally. At the end of the visit, David promised to come again. Naturally, Mrs. Nelson didn't really believe that he would keep his promise. Thus, when David came back the next morning, the old woman was very surprised, but also genuinely happy. Ever since then, David came to see Mrs. Nelson almost every day, showing touching concern for her health and mood. Eventually, the nursing home staff started calling him Mrs. Nelson's grandson, unaware that the two weren't actually related. Time passed, and Mrs. Nelson grew more and more attached to David. It's worth noting that during this period, Floyd and Ethan never bothered to pay Mrs. Nelson a visit, and even more so, they never once called her. Unfortunately, despite David's care and the help of the nursing home staff, Mrs. Nelson's health began to deteriorate rapidly in the fall. Having realized that her time was coming, the old woman started talking to David more about what he wanted to achieve in life. "Actually, I dream of opening a sports center for children. I'd let any kid in, so that orphans and children from dysfunctional families could play sports instead of roaming the streets aimlessly. I would have done it already, but I don't have the money. But that's fine. Maybe I'll save up enough by the time I get old," David answered, somewhat sarcastically. Mrs. Nelson thought for a moment, then asked the young man to come over and said quietly, "Well, I can't really help you open a sports center, but I can give you some sports equipment. I got an old garage from my husband. There's all sorts of trash there, rusty tools of all kinds, etc. But there's also a kettlebell there. It weighs 55 pounds. Do you know what I'm talking about?" "Of course I do. I've been into sports since childhood," David answered. At that moment, the young man couldn't have even imagined what kind of surprise Priscilla Nelson had prepared for him. Having taken the key to the garage, David went to fulfill the old woman's wish without any ulterior motive. He found the kettlebell she told him about fairly quickly. But when the man decided to do some simple exercises with it, he could barely even lift it off the ground. And that was despite the fact that David worked out regularly. There was obviously something wrong with the kettlebell. The young man was sure that it weighed a lot more than 55 pounds. David looked at it from different angles, turned it around, but the mystery remained unsolved. Everything became clear a little later when David decided to clear the dust off it. It was then that the man saw a glimpse of metal of a noble yellow color. "Dear God, that's gold!" David exclaimed and almost fainted. The thing was that it wasn't just a regular kettlebell. It was made of the purest gold. This kettlebell with the golden secret was passed down from generation to generation and was made by Priscilla Nelson's great-great-grandfather, who was known as a wealthy landowner. And now this treasure was passed down to David. Barely managing to get the kettlebell home, the man rushed to the nursing home as fast as he could. But when David arrived there, a tearful nurse came out to greet him. "I'm sorry, sir. Mrs. Nelson died of a heart attack an hour ago. The doctors did everything they could, but sometimes even medicine is powerless," the young woman answered with a sob. Feeling dizzy, David stepped aside and pressed his back against the wall. He was feeling miserable over the fact that he didn't even get a chance to say goodbye to the woman who became his mother and his grandmother in one person. Tears were flowing down the young man's face, but they didn't bring him any relief. David took care of all the funeral and wake arrangements. The worst part of it all was that Ethan and Floyd didn't even bother to come to Mrs. Nelson's funeral. After seeing the old woman off on her last journey, David set to work on his goal. A year later, the local residents learned that David Green had opened a free sports center for children and teenagers. Floyd and Ethan did eventually find out who gave David money to open his center. Being an honest man, David even gave them a small part of the proceeds from the sale of the gold, and he knew that Mrs. Nelson would have certainly approved. Thanking the young man for his help, the residents of the city didn't even know that it was all made possible by one kind elderly woman who was now said to be in heaven and lovingly watching David and his brainchild.